Welcome again, all. Dr. JC here, week 8, halfway home, week 8. This week we're going to talk about this market, transportation, and communication revolution that takes place in the early 1800s. More specifically, we're going to look at ways the United States focuses its efforts on infrastructure development, roads, canals, communication systems, and the way that impacts common Americans, technology and innovation, entrepreneurship, sectionalism, North versus South versus an emerging West, and importantly, America's status in the world. You have this continent of seemingly unlimited resources. What are you going to do with them? And if you figure out what to do with them, how powerful can you be? So let's jump first into this American system as conceived by a very prominent figure in American history that we're going to talk about quite a bit in weeks ahead. From Kentucky, his name is Henry Clay. Now, before we jump into this American system, I'd like to draw your attention to the comic here. There are 3 individuals depicted in this illustration. The one on the right is Henry Clay. He will become the voice of power and promotion of the West. He's from Kentucky. The one in the center seated is Daniel Webster. He will become the individual whose voice will lead the interests of the North. He's from Massachusetts. And the gentleman from the left is John C. Calhoun. We'll talk much about John C. Calhoun moving forward. He represents South Carolina. These 3 together will be known as the Great Triumvirate, arguably amongst the best negotiators and compromisers, at least for a while, in the U.S. Senate. So in U.S. Senate history, these 3 are remembered as the Great Triumvirate. And we'll talk much about these 3 in the weeks ahead for sure. Now, as it relates to Clay's American system more specifically, understand that this was really an economic plan at the federal level to help not only bring states and different sections of the country together, but to promote business and trade within and across each of these sections as well, especially in the West. After all, Henry Clay's from Kentucky, so any promotion of business and trade in the West theoretically should help build the 401ks and pocketbooks of folks from the West, solidify the West as a central player in this larger political jockeying that's happening between the North and the South. And if one were to have political aspirations, presidential aspirations, as Clay does, why not have a prominent piece of political program, governmental program, in your name, especially if it's a successful one? Yet, as the comic here tries to illustrate, especially if you look on the left, John C. Calhoun coming in the door stating, "What a humbug." Not all aspects or elements of this were potentially appealing to all sections. A particular sticking point for Clay in the South was number 1 on the slide here, support for a high protective tariff. Now, we're not going to get in deep detail here as it relates to protective tariffs because all of our heads will explode, right? But it is worth noting that protective tariffs are usually put in place to promote some industry within one's own country. So if we're talking about promoting industry more generally in the United States, and because most of your industrial development was in the North and parts of the what would be upper Midwest or upper West, those sections would benefit from this protective tariff. While the South, however, would likely experience a loss in profits. And much of that has to do with import and export taxes. Because most products were shipped abroad from the United States, specifically from the South, any tax placed on those goods being shipped abroad would result in reduced profit margins for Southern planters. So if you're from the South, you're saying, WTF, right? I get we want to promote industry, but this is like promoting profits in the North at the expense of the South. I don't know this is so fair. Again, I don't want to get into great detail on it here, but just understand the tariff or tariffs will be an ongoing wedge issue of sorts between the North and the South throughout the remainder of this course, as we'll see. And in fact, some historians have even gone so far as to make the argument, I think a bit of a stretch, but there's some kernel of truth to it, that this tariff controversy is one of the things that led to the American Civil War. Again, we'll talk more about that as we move further into the course in weeks ahead. Now, relative to the American system itself and the selling of this idea, idea, Clay took up the mantle that the West and South should support this. Understand, many politicians in the West and the South didn't support this. Clay's argument was, well, this is stupid. Of course we should support internal improvements, building roads, bridges, canals to expedite trade, largely because, yeah, if industry in the North continues to grow and they may see potential tax advantages from this tariff system, we in the West and the South will benefit from this as well, because as their industry expands, they'll be buying our food from the West and our cotton from the South. Therefore, while you may be losing some profits from abroad, Southern planters, those profits will be made up from increased business with mills in the North and systems of manufacturing that are emerging in the North, like the Lowell system, which we'll talk about here briefly later in this lecture. And at the end of the day, Clay says, all Americans, more specifically American power, through increased business activity, increased industrialization, the strengthening of a growing middle class, all these things will help America both domestically and internationally. And while I'm not going to get into all the specifics as it relates to various canal projects like the Erie Canal, road systems like corduroy roads and plank roads, although the plank roads and the use of wood, very important to the Williamsport area here in Pennsylvania. They do call this place the Millionaires or Millionaire Row on 4th Street in town, because of the timber barons that were making huge money in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s with the expansion of these internal improvements. But I am going to pause a little bit here and talk briefly about the Cumberland Road, because this becomes, for all intents and purposes, Clay's signature venture as a way to promote and illustrate this American system. This Cumberland Road, also known as the National Road, was designed to link the East and the West. And while one might look at this map and say, well, how in the blue blazes is this going to benefit Kentucky, let alone the rest of the South? Understand that in conjunction with, and to some degree parallel to, this national road, other systems of internal improvements are being developed as well. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, Baltimore and Ohio Canal, river and harbor improvements along the Ohio River linking into the Mississippi then flowing where? South to New Orleans into the Gulf of Mexico. Therefore, states like Kentucky, Tennessee, new territories that are fast becoming states, which will eventually be Alabama and Mississippi, they will be able to take advantage of increased trade and business expansion via these internal improvements as well. And the faster folks from the West and the South can move their produce to major port cities, whether they be along the East Coast or along the South via the Gulf of Mexico, that will only serve to increase the speed by which America can continue to build on this fast growing acceptance among the world's players that the United States is a breadbasket. They can supply food to the world. I'm not saying that this is American staple production is on par with Egypt, but if you go back to ancient Egypt, he who has the grain, for all intents and purposes, has the gold and gets to make the rules. And the United States is fast being recognized as a leader in this capacity. And thus this national road becomes a symbol of what America could be. Hence the name, the American system. And underneath the business expansion and social impacts that has, with increased wealth, which means perhaps better housing, better schools, so on and so forth, is this idea of an America. We're going to try to break down the sectional differences, the cultural differences between North and South and West. We're going to try to move from that small U and capital S to maybe a capital U now and capital S. A truly United States. America first, so to speak. Now, as one might imagine, this business expansion is going to lead to further investment in research and development, in new technologies, in new innovations. And thus, alongside these transportation and market revolutions meaning increased business activity, increased engagement by average everyday people in commerce, is this communication revolution. In the 1830s, and by the time we get to the mid-1840s, individuals like Alfred Vail and Samuel Morse will come up with this telegraph system, sending messages via wire. Parallel to this are individuals working across the Atlantic. The John Bretts, Charles Brights, and Cyrus Fields, creating this Atlantic Telegraph Company, seeking to send electronic communication from the old world to the new in a matter of minutes. You may recall part of the impetus for this type of venture came from the War of 1812, specifically that Battle of New Orleans, which took place after the war was officially over. And while it won't take place until almost the American Civil War, the middle years of President Buchanan's administration, that's the administration that precedes Lincoln's, a message will be successfully sent from Ireland to Newfoundland, from the old world to the new. Amazing technology and innovation. And in conjunction with ongoing internal improvements in the United States, individuals start to say, look, why don't we expand roads and communication at the same time? We're clearing areas to go ahead and build in a road. Why not make use of that timber in the form of communication poles and string wire right alongside these roads? So we'll expedite business and communication at the same time. And for those that might know a little something about the Eisenhower interstate system that we see in the mid-20th century, many of the principles that were applied and put into place here as it relates to internal improvements, transportation and communication, will be used during the reimagination of this American system from Clay's day. Now, in the couple minutes we have left here, I want to talk briefly about some of the social impacts of this transportation, communication, and market revolution, specifically in relation to women and labor. With the growth of industry, especially in the north, places like New England, there was an increased need for labor. And as a result of that, women began to enter the workplace more fully. Now, this is a great departure from that old Republican motherhood, the idea that mom stayed at home, she was the nucleus of the family, she was responsible for educating the children, rearing them as good Republican citizens. And so when females began to leave the home for the factory, so to speak, questions about who should be raising the kids or educating the kids emerged. Should we have public school systems? The larger social and to some extent political questions emerge from this. And what about working conditions for women? Shouldn't they be paid the same as men? They're doing the same job. And why are they stuck in this housing, these mill towns? These mill owners own the manufacturing and the rental housing, the tenements. And so it makes it pretty easy for them. If they're going to go ahead and give a raise the next year, then they just magically raise the rent the same amount. And as a result, no one ever gets anywhere. You create wage slaves, so to speak. And so women begin to say, look, maybe collectively we should start to push back here. Perhaps we should create unions, add numbers to our voices. Beyond the challenges faced by women, average day laboring men were impacted by not only price competition from women entering the workforce, but technological innovation too. McCormick's mechanical reaper, interestingly enough, McCormick from Virginia, so a southerner helping to transform northern society to some extent, his reaper limited the need for entrepreneurs to have so much labor. And while there would be cost for the equipment up front, over time the increased productivity and efficiency would way more than pay for the reaper itself. And as a result, many of these day laborers now move to cities looking for work, finding women entering the workforce at the same time. You have a labor supply, which means wages come down, and it leads to then what? People out of work. An urban problem now. We have urban poor to deal with. And how best to deal with the urban poor, we'll take that up in week 11 ahead. And just as a southerner has transformed northern society with a technological innovation, a northerner will do the same in the south. Eli Whitney's cotton engine. Well, an invention that's long been in use, I mean, this dates back to the 500s in the Indian subcontinent. It did transform the production of cotton in the South and, by extension, slavery. The upfront cost associated with owning slaves was cost prohibitive for most individuals in the South, and therefore they were precluded from being able to partake in this very lucrative cotton business and cotton trade. But Whitney's engine changes that. With a few cranks of a hand roller, I can separate cotton seed from the fiber and eliminate tons of labor. With increased production, northern textile mills increase production, and the growth of slavery becomes pronounced. tying business interests in the North with planters in the South. And all of this growth in the United States will lead to a change in its ideology. We'll talk about that in weeks ahead.